Hey there, welcome to today's episode. And as you can see, we are diving in with the Dr. Sample SP-303. I want to make a bit of a beat on this thing, talk about the process, and give you a sort of mini tutorial on how to use this thing. So let's start off. Now, this is going to be a live and unedited video. I'll put some time codes in. You can skip through to the parts that you like. We're just going to take a quick overview of the device itself. It's a nice little compact hardware unit, hardware sampler, completely standalone, doesn't require a computer. And other than the fact that you have a smart media card, doesn't really have any way of connecting to a computer either. We have some MIDI, so of course you can connect to MIDI devices, and I guess you can connect to MIDI via your computer that way. But essentially, it's a little old school sampler from 2001, and it has some really great effects, really nice spongy pads that you can play, which I think are kind of nicer than the more modern SP-404 Mark II. Kind of wish they were soft and spongy like this. But overall, that's what it is. It's a small standalone sampler with a bunch of effects. It's fairly limited, and we're going to talk about all the limitations and the workarounds as we go through. The overall look of it looks kind of 80s, even though it's from 2001. Looks like Knight Rider to me. But I love the look of it. Very simple layout with 4 rotaries at the top. We have a volume control. Controls 1 to 3 affect different parameters. Some effects here in the middle, and don't worry, I'm going to cover all of these. The pattern sequencer, sample playback modes and recording modes, some basic function buttons, some banks here, and some pads. Now, we'll talk about those first just to get that out of the way. You can use the internal memory and you can use the smart media card. So you have 2 banks for your internal memory, 2 banks for the smart media card. I always have my project completely blank. I think the internal samples that came with the device, because this is 20 plus years old, are long gone. I don't know what samples it ever had. When I bought this, it was completely empty. And generally, because I'm a sample head, I keep it empty. So I'm not interested in loading up the smart media card. I have the reader to do so, but you need to plug the reader in. You have to rename all the samples. It's long-winded, and to me, it just becomes a pain. So I don't use the internal very much for calling up samples. And I don't use the internal too much because this device has a working time, which you will see as we go through and we make something here. It has a bit of working time where when you're deleting things, truncating, whatever you're doing, it has to think about it a little bit. More modern devices, the MPC Koala sampler, it's pretty much instantaneous. So when you work from the internal, that working time is really slow. And when you work from the smart media card, I think it's just about manageable. It's okay working like that. So it is a limited device, and I just want to, show you all of that. So we're not going to be calling up any internal samples. If you wanted to, and you had internal samples loaded here, you can do cancel and press one of your banks. I get this empty message because I have nothing on here. And I'm mainly going to be working from bank C, possibly bank D, and just try and keep things nice and simple. So we're going to be recording all of the samples into use because that's what I enjoy doing with this. I like it blank, and we'll go from there. We only have 8 pads per bank, but again, you can resample, you can do different things, and I'll show you that. So it's not as limited as it might seem, having only 8 pads. We have an external source button here, so we can listen to our incoming signal. And in terms of the other ins and outs, very quickly, an output to speakers and monitors, a line in, which will take any audio, and I'm going to be using Koala Sampler today, because all my sample packs are here just to send audio in, be a little bit of a helper for us. And of course, we have a line in through a microphone as well at the front, or a microphone port that could be used for other things as well, guitars, anything you want to sample in through the front, with a gain level knob there, so you can adjust the gain input, the memory card slot, and a headphone socket. In terms of bringing samples in, we have a peak meter here, and if we turn external source on, which is how we listen to our samples, you will notice it is peaking a little bit here. According to the manual, if you had a loop that was playing with a lot of information, whatever it is, and this was just a solid red light, then chances are that input signal is going to be way too hot, and when you record, you're going to hear it and it's going to be distorted. I'm going to play around with this, hopefully it's going to be just fine. But this is the little meter that we use to just double check if anything seems like it's going to be crazy loud. It is peaking a little bit, but according to the manual, we'll probably be okay with that. So for now, that's something to keep an eye on as well. We want to record some samples in and get started. So the first thing I'm going to show you is recording threshold, because that will save you a lot of time and effort, particularly if you're like me and you like sampling. We have the ability to trim start and end points, do punch in a sort of start and end point marker, and do a few different things here. However, I just want to sample a kick drum, and I want to do that as quickly as possible. So I set a recording threshold, which means that the device waits before it starts recording to listen for the input signal rather than just recording straight away. So if we do cancel and record here, you'll notice we get this 0 parameter, this 0 value on our display. And with Control 3 here, I can change that from 0 to 8. When 0 is enabled, when I press record, it's going to start recording straight away. Anything from that point on, from 1 to 8, is a recording threshold, and it is going to wait for us to press a sound, play a turntable, whatever your sound is, before it begins recording. So essentially what we can do is we can lose the dead space at the beginning that you might create if it just records instantly, so we don't have to tune a starting point. And with something as simple as a kick drum, as long as I'm quick to stop the recording, I won't have to worry about any tail either. So it's a very quick way of getting drum samples onto the device. In terms of the way it works, if you set your threshold, if you have a very quiet sample and it doesn't begin to start recording, which you'll see on the device when I show you, if it doesn't start recording, it means that the sample is too low and you would have to bring this threshold value down. Of course, you can set it up for louder samples. And for this, I'm going to go at 3 and just see how it works out for us. When I press record, it flashes and it saves that parameter. And unless I go back and do cancel and record and turn it off, it's going to be set and be good to go throughout the course of making this beat. And I definitely don't like doing start points. If I can avoid it, I just want to, be as quick as possible. So we now want to record one of these kick drums. Need to have our external source on. Let's say kick drum 10 is what I wanted. I want to record it to a pad, of course. I'm going to press record, which we can see here, nice and easy. Anything flashing is free, and because this is completely blank, I can do pad 1 here. You will notice when I hit record again, it now tells me that this is ready to record. When I press my sample, it's going to begin to record. It should do that automatically, unless I need to adjust the threshold. And then I will press record once the sample is done and try and be as quick as I can with it. So let's do that now. We played that sample and we hit stop pretty quick so we don't have a tail. When working with a limited amount of internal storage and smart media storage, you want to be mindful of long tails and bits of excess audio, something else you need to think about. But we should now have a pretty much perfect kick drum on here, ready to go. And it sounds fantastic, and as I say, these pads feel great. So a very simple process. We can now choose a hi-hat, make sure this is on. Let's say I wanted that one. I can do exactly the same thing, and I can choose a pad. Now the other options you get here, in terms of recording, are to record in stereo. So if I wanted this to be a stereo sample, or with lo-fi or the long effect enabled. So you have long, and then when it's blinking, it's lo-fi. And that will just, it kind of degrades the sample quality a little bit, which can be pleasing. It can be a creative choice, and it gives you a bit more in terms of your memory space. So keep that in mind. This is the time where you would set those if you want to do that. The other thing to talk about very quickly is polyphony and the reasons why you might change different modes. When we are talking about patterns and we're recording our samples that we're going to make into a pattern, I can do 8 mono samples at exactly the same time. That's the kind of polyphony that the device has. It will allow me to do that. And 4 stereo recorded samples. So not a huge amount, but enough. When it comes to resampling, and I'm going to do a resampling demonstration where I resample a whole drum loop, just so I can show you a couple of other things, that amount is split in half. So I can resample up to 4 mono samples at the same time and only 2 stereo samples. So there are a couple of workarounds and things we'll talk about a little bit later on. Keep that in mind that this device is limited in terms of the polyphony, especially when you're resampling something. So for now, we've got that set up. I'm not worried about lo-fi or stereo. We'll do exactly the same. We'll press record. Let that sample play through. And again, we have that. And you'll notice it does have a little bit of a working time on the sampler as it's recording. It's not instantaneous. I don't mind that though. slows me down, makes me enjoy the process. And I do think this is kind of fun. So we need a snare drum to just complete this basic drum set. And what I'm going to do here, I'm going to come out of my snares because this is one of my own sample packs. And I like to put a lot of reverb on my snares, but I want to show you how to do that with resampling. So I don't know, let's pick one of these. I'm sure there'll be a dry snare in here somewhere. That one should be perfect. So let's now record that to pad 3. Record, pad, record, and stop. You can see when I'm not chatting about it, it's a quick thing to do. Nice and simple. The first thing here, we want to just play with the volume of a sample. That is way too loud. So let's do start, end, and level here. And with Control 3, I can change the level of that sample. Might make it a little quieter. And as I said before, there is no velocity sensitivity on these pads. They are a set volume, so it's like having fixed velocity on something else. If you wanted to introduce variation there, then you can do that in a bunch of different ways, but I would, resample these pads down with different volumes, and then I could play those between if you want to just add like a little bit more life in there. But we're keeping it nice and simple. So start, end, and level here, we can reduce the volume down of a particular pad. Sounds better. So I like to add a little reverb to my snare drums here. It just sounds nice, gives it a little bit of a room vibe. I need to do that using resampling. And the reason for that is because I can select an effect here. So we have our effects. We have 5 main effects that we can turn on. We have the basic ones, filter and drive, pitch, delay, vinyl sim, and the isolator. And then we have the M effects, which allows me to choose one of these 21 samples here. So we've got a really nice list. If I hold down M effects and use Control 3, you can see I can choose the number. And reverb is number 1. And you'll hear I've now put that on. The reason I want to resample it is because if I wanted to layer that effect, I can only have one of these samples enabled at a time. So I can have some delay if I like, or the isolator, or the reverb. And that is fine. When we are creating a pattern, if we just wanted one of these effects, applied to like the snare drum, I could do that. However, that doesn't give me much room to maneuver later on when I've created a whole pattern. And maybe I want to use the vinyl sim and some other things. So you have to get into the idea of resampling and baking that effect down so that you can then layer and do the same thing again. And it would also allow me to, have maybe the MFX and the delay because I can just keep resampling over. So in this case, we want to use the reverb. You will notice that it's only on the pad that I selected. But if I wanted to add it to the other pads, I can do remain. And now all of these have it. And of course, I can take it off of there and have them all dry again. You can also do remain and MFX, and it will apply it to every single sample inside of the project on all of the banks. So that's a quick way of applying it to everything if you need to. And again, you can turn that off. But if you want to, remain and MFX will apply it to everything. We want to go back and just simply apply it to here. Now with every effect, you get a certain amount of parameters that you can change. So in this case with reverb, and we're not going to go through all of these, of course, the video would be too long, but bear in mind you can do this. With Control 1 to 3, we can change certain parameters. Control 3 is the volume in this case for the reverb, or the wet and dry mix if you like. How much do we want? The level of that. I'm going to leave it quite loud for a second. The second one here is tone. So we can have, a bright sound or a dull sound because of course it's using the lows, the mids and the highs essentially. I'm going to put it in the middle somewhere or ish. Sounds good to me. And then I can use this one for the timing of it. So a short reverb or a long one. And again, somewhere in the middle sounds good to me. I'll just dial it back a little bit. Just want to add a little bit room sort of reverb to the snare. So we can do that. And then we can use our resampling mode to bake that effect into a new sample. Now, the thing to talk about here before we do that, we're talking about basic functions. There is no copy button on this device, unfortunately. So if I've got a kick drum here, and I just wanted to make a copy of that onto, say, pad 6, so that I've got 2 of these, there is no copy button to do it. You have to use resampling, which is a little long-winded, but it is what it is. And that's essentially what we're going to do here. So if I just wanted a copy of this kick drum, I could resample. I wouldn't apply any effects because I just want a copy of it. And we're doing the same thing here, only this time we're, making a copy, but with a little bit of an effect applied. So we've got our reverb. We're going to do resample. We get this level notification. So let's say you've got a bunch of samples and you're going to resample those to one pad, maybe a drum loop like we'll do a little bit later. Maybe I'm going to apply some effects to that or whatever it is. I'm going to start getting really loud and I might be peaking out a little bit here. I can set with Control 3 a volume level for the recording to make onto that pad. So if I want to make it a little bit quieter, so I'm giving myself some headroom overall, I can do that. In this case, I'm going to keep it at 127, but know that you can do that before you set up. So then we can do record here. We can choose a destination pad, of course. Hit record again. And rather than seeing ready this time, because we're in resampling mode, we see the pads flashing for, the available playable pads. And when I press one of these, it begins the recording. So we don't have to worry about a start time. We just need to be mindful to press the stop button to stop recording once it's done. So we're going to press our snare drum here with the effect applied. Give it a little room for the tail there because the reverb's got to fade out. And that is now resampled onto this pad. So that is your way of copying pads if you need to. You can do it with effects, of course, or you can just make up, copies, plain copies of other pads. It's unfortunate it doesn't have a dedicated copy button, but that's what it is. So we've now put this here. We can now talk a little bit about the playback modes because I think that's an important basic function as well. And you can hear, as I've been starting out, I haven't done anything. All of these are one shot by enable, so that means they play the sample all the way through one time. And I can change that mode if I like. So if I wanted that to be gated, and it's only going to play for as long as I press my finger on the pad, I can do that. It's not as easy to demonstrate with such short samples, but keep that in mind. It only plays while my finger is pressed. We can loop a sample. We can stop that. We can reverse our samples, and you can do those in combination. So if I just press reverse, it reverses the sample. If I loop it, we can get that kind of effect. And you can resample all of that so you can get some nice creative effects. You can do gate and loop as well. So it will loop, but only while my finger is pressed. Like that. And the other function with gate mode is like a temporary one-shot mode. So like the default here, just plays the sample once. With this, it's gated, so it only plays like that. But if I do this and then tap hold very quickly, it plays the whole sample through. Hold doesn't light up, so don't let that confuse you. But you can have it short or play the whole sample by pressing hold. So you can have a temporary one-shot mode, which is quite useful. So we now have playback modes. We understand kind of some basic functions here. I want to tidy up a little bit and then demonstrate something else to you. So I want to delete, I want to get rid of this pad here because this is the dry snare. I'm not going to use it. I want to delete it. I select it, press delete, and we delete it. And you'll notice it's got a bit of a countdown, takes a bit of a second to do, but it's not a huge problem. We now want to move this around, which is strange. This is why I don't understand why there's no copy button, because we have a button here. If we do delete and record, we can actually change position of a pad. So I want number 4 to be on number 3. I hit record. Again, it's got a little working time, but it allows me to do that. So why there was never any copy function, it seems a little bit strange. Maybe they just thought resampling isn't that much of a hassle, which I guess it isn't. But yeah. So we've now moved, this is now blank. We have our drum samples and we're good to go. Before we dive in and we make a drum loop using these, I want to talk about another recording feature because I think this is overlooked sometimes, unless you're a real big fan of scrolling through manuals. And for this, I'm going to need a drum loop. Now, it doesn't matter what kind of loop you've got. It can be drums, could be something melodic, but it's something that you want to record in, and you want to have another easy workflow where you don't have to adjust your start and end points, or very little, if any. You can record to a BPM value, but you of course need to know the BPM value of what you are recording. So let me demonstrate that, as it'll make more sense. What we want to do is we want to record something here. I've got this Crooklyn drums, and I'm going to load that into Koala. Let's load that in. I'll turn on my external source so we can listen. You can hear very nice, simple, basic drum loop. I know it's 78 BPM, and this is 4 bars long, so we've got plenty to play with. Let's say I only want to record 1 bar of this. When we go through our recording steps, we can just tweak a couple of things. So we'll do it again. We'll record. We'll choose a pad. Again, stereo or lo-fi, if that's what I want, I can do that. And just for fun, why don't we just put it in lo-fi mode so I can demonstrate that? I don't use it very often because it's a little bit too lo-fi for me, but we could do that now. The other thing that I can also set here is a BPM. So what we're doing is we're setting the internal BPM for the device using Control 2. And if I shift down to match the loop that we're bringing in, which is going to be 78 BPM, it's another little time saver, because what it does, if I play this now, and I'll do it as a demonstration, I will record this drum loop here. I'm going to press play, of course, and it's going to do the same thing. It's going to wait and then start recording. So we don't need to worry about the beginning. I'm going to record 1 bar out of this 4-bar loop, but I will deliberately wait until I get to, say, like the kick drum of the 2nd bar, and just, pretend that my timing's a little bit sloppy, and I'll leave that extra kick to show you what goes on here. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to hit record. It's ready. Let's put this in 1 shot, and we're going to record 1 bar, let the 2nd, bar kick drum kick in, and then I'll stop recording. So you can hear that I deliberately left that as if my timing was pretty sloppy, and I've got this extra kick drum. You'll notice it's lit up the mark point here. So start points and end points can be marked in. We don't have any middle chopping points, and I'm going to dive into all of that a little bit later on. But you will notice it's done something because it's put in a marker point. And what it's done, because we were working to 78, although we don't have a metronome to listen to in recording mode like this, we can, when we do pattern select, we can hear a metronome, but here we don't get the metronome. It is recording to 78 BPM, and it is smart enough to determine where 78 BPM is in terms of its length. And what it should do, and hopefully quite successfully, is move that endpoint over for us, so it deliberately gets rid of that extra kick drum and just saves us another step. It means I shouldn't really have to tweak too much of the start and end points to get a perfect loop. Now, it's not an exact science, and I'm using a loop here that isn't quantized. It's off the grid because I made it. So we're not giving it the most fair chance, but let's see how it did. And we can do that by, of course, pressing our sample pad. And if I have loop on, we'll hear how well it's looped that 1 bar. Pretty darn well. So it's moved it, it's automatically created 78 BPM, and of course you can hear the lo-fi effect, which I just wanted to demo for you so you know what that sounds like. But yeah, it's saved us some time now. It also gives me an opportunity to show you another function, which is truncate. So when we have our sample and it's had that, it's done what it suggested. It's found a new endpoint for us, it's created it, which we know because the mark point is lit up. Now that's only a temporary measure. If I press this pad and then press the mark button again, I can delete that, and the sample will play through, including the extra kick drum that we wanted to chop off. So it's not a permanent thing, but if we wanted to make it permanent, tidy up, crop out any unwanted noise, and this could be on a sample that you've recorded that has dead space at the beginning and the end, we've used our start and end point marks to create the chunk of audio that we want, and anything that we don't want, we want to truncate down, because again, memory is kind of precious on these devices. So in order to truncate that down and just get rid of that extra kick drum, we can do delete here. We choose the pad that we want to truncate. we press mark, not delete, because that will delete it. But when we press mark, we can truncate any dead space, press delete, and it'll just take a second to work through that, as it does with everything else. And now we've truncated that. And you'll know it's worked because we won't have a mark point set anymore on the pad. Now, there may be a little click or a pop in there that we could have used the start and end point controls to just tweak that out, but I'm going to show you that later on. And we're not even going to keep this drum loop, but I wanted you to know that you can record to a timing, to a BPM that you set internally on the device, and as long as it matches your external input source, it's going to do a little bit of the work of trimming that end point for you, as long as you have it set with the threshold so you don't have to worry about the beginning point, and it saves you a job. It's another time saver in terms of your workflow, so you can do that. Again, we're going to test some functions here. And what you'll notice as well, with any samples that you've applied something to, like the lo-fi, if it was a stereo sample, when I press the sample, as I move over to this one, if it has any of these applied, they light up when that sample is playing, which is nice and handy because maybe you want to know which ones are in stereo or have the lo-fi. You can see that because it lights up on the appropriate pad. We're just going to delete this out, so I'm going to do delete, hit the pad again and delete. And we've got rid of that loop, so we can go back to our original drum sounds that we cultivated before. So we now have these. And I want to make a new drum loop from scratch. I want to resample it down and just bake it in. I, of course, can create a new pattern. I can set the BPM, and we'll go through making a pattern later on, but I want to demonstrate a few other things that are handy on this device. So I can record those into a pattern and just keep them independent and still play around with them and volumes and stuff. But if you like resampling like I do, this is a good way to show you how to do that. So I'm going to do resample. We're going to choose a level if we needed to. I'm not going to be too concerned about it. If I wanted to apply an effect, I could do it at this point as well because we're resampling. So I want to gritty these drums up a little bit. I could choose a distortion, the vinyl sim or something. Again, I'm not going to bother, but this would be the time that I could do this. I can set that level, which again, we'll leave where it is. But we can now hit record, choose an empty pad, of course, and hit record. It's now waiting because we're in resampling mode. So as soon as I hit one of these pads, it's going to begin to play, it's going to begin to record, and we can make our recording as long as we like. In this case, I'm going to record probably 2 bars. I'm not going to worry about a metronome. I'm just going to do this because I want to take a look at BPM values and calculation. But if you want it to be more accurate, a quick tip is that if you've got an external device, another device plugged in that isn't using the input source or the line in here, because that would be recorded, but my SP-304 Mark II, which is off screen here, actually is hooked up so that I can hear it, but it's not coming through this device. If I press record, got a slow metronome going there. I could record to a metronome if I wanted to create, a BPM, a loop, say my drum loop, I want it to be exactly 90 BPM or as close as. I can use an external metronome because you don't get one here in resampling mode. But if you've got an external device, a phone with a metronome app on, you can do that. It's a nice handy little tip. This one I'm just going to do on the fly because I want to show you how this calculates BPM and a couple of other things that we can do here. So we are good to go in order to record this. The next tip I'm going to give you, again, is a workflow tip so that you don't need to do more trimming or generally try and avoid it. Because trimming start and ends is fine, but if you can avoid it and you just get a loop perfect, why not? When I start recording here, no metronome, but we'll record 2 bars worth. When I get to the end of my 2 bars, which will be my loop, I could, of course, just stop the recording and then I'd have to mess around. What I want to do is I want to pretend like I'm going to play the 3rd bar, and I'm going to pretend like I'm going to hit the first kick drum of that 3rd bar, but instead I'm going to use the timing of that and not hit the kick drum button, but hit the stop recording button. And that way you usually get a pretty consistent, decent loop without the need to trim it or chop it up. There are other ways that you can do it, and we'll talk about start and end points later on, but for me, when I'm doing loops like this, that seems to be the quickest option. So watch as I record around. As I get to the end of the 2nd bar, I'm going to almost press my 3rd kick drum here for the 3rd bar, but I'm going to hit record instead to stop the recording. Just a nice simple little trick. BPM we'll worry about later on. We'll just record something in. little drum loop. And as I said, the timing of it, I tried to get at the end there. So we have now recorded our new sample here. And if we put it in loop mode, we can listen through and just check and see if it sounds like a pretty good loop. And it does, sounds pretty good, no real great problems there. We now have the loop. Of course, we can loop that up using loop mode. And what I want to talk about quickly is just BPM. So what you'll notice here, with every sample that we use or we record in, it calculates a BPM value. Now for individual kick drums, that's not going to be particularly important, but we've just created this loop and it would be nice to know what the BPM is. And of course we can see that here, reckons it's 80 BPM. We don't get a point value, it doesn't go that far down. So in terms of me playing that without any metronome and just going through, the chances of that being exactly 80 BPM are probably impossible. I'm sure it is either, 79 point something or it's 80 point something. It's going to be close, but it's not going to be exact. And that might come into play in a second. But just keep that in mind, it kind of rounds that value up. One problem that you get sometimes, you'll notice when it calculated this one before, it thinks it's 152 BPM. You will sometimes have that happen with your loop. And if you need to adjust that, you get it's essentially a half-time, double-time issue. And when you record into Ableton, sometimes it happens. The same with something like the SP-404 Mark II. Anything that calculates a BPM can sometimes get that wrong. If your display is wrong, let's say it doubled this and it was saying 160, I can go into time and BPM and use Control 2 here. And you'll notice for some reason it's gone to 161, which is probably giving me an indication that that is 80 point something. It's like a little hint there that BPM is probably 80 point something. But you'll notice that if it looks like this, you could change it. You could switch it to 80, even down to 40 if that's what you think the correct BPM is. So you have this Control 2 with BPM to just fix that essentially. So we're going on the basis now that I think this is, maybe it's 80.5, 80.6, whatever. We now have recorded a loop. We know that we're roughly at 80 BPM, which is kind of handy because we can begin to put a pattern together and talk about that. Now we're going to need some more samples, but we're going to get to that and we'll get there a little bit later on. First, let's talk about creating a pattern and then using this loop that we've just made to go into that pattern. So I can do pattern select here, and I can then choose some recording modes. The first thing what I am going to do, actually, let's come out of pattern select. And when you're in pattern select, because it's highlighted, usually there's something on the display, but you can tell that way. I want to quickly delete what we don't need. So I'm going to delete, and I'll come back in and delete the other things. There is no way to delete, like say just 2 pads or 3 pads and leave one. You can either delete individually, or you can do a couple of things here. You can do cancel and delete, and you can delete everything from the banks, but that is delete all. So it does delete everything. So you need to be careful of that. You can delete all and it will delete just the samples from the pads. It doesn't delete the patterns. You have to do that separately in pattern select. So that is kind of handy sometimes. Maybe you just want to clear out all of the samples, but you want to keep your patterns. Bear in mind though that those patterns use those samples. So if you delete these samples and you keep the pattern, you're basically keeping the pattern information, but you're not keeping the samples that coincide with that. So delete all is not going to be useful here, but I wanted to mention it. Another thing you can do if you're having performance problems and you just want to clear out the whole, smart media card is I think it's cancel and remain, and you can do format. And you can format your entire card. Again, we're not going to do that. So in this case, I have to delete things individually. We'll delete number 2. And we'll delete 3. And again, delete and record to change. I can change the position of this pad, and I want to put that one now over here. So I'm going to select that one, select pad 1, do record. And it just gives me some room to bring in some sample chops or some other samples that we'll play with later on. So let's go back to pattern select. We are now going to look at making a pattern here. Again, I want to keep it on my banks here. I'm not interested particularly in putting them to the internal, but I could do. Pattern record is how you set this off, of course. So we can see that written under record. We press record. And we'll get this metronome suddenly start to play. Start, end, and level lets us change the volume of that because it's quite loud. And for now, while I'm just chatting, I'm going to turn that completely off. But bear in mind, of course, you've got a metronome that you can adjust using this button here. It's waiting for us to choose a pad. And of course, we get 8 blank pads that we can put our patterns onto. And I could do that on another bank so we can expand that out. But for now, we'll just use pattern 1 here. And now we can set some other parameters for our recording. The first thing we need to do would be the BPM, which we're going to maybe, we can just set this with a numerical value. But if we wanted to hear that metronome again, just to make sure, I can set the BPM. And I can't remember which one of it that changes this. Yeah, it's Control 2. So we can set that to whatever we want. Now, we want to set it to whatever we think our drum loop is, which we think it's 80. That's our rough guide. So I'm going to set Control 2 to 80. I know that I created 2 bars here. Let's just turn that off again for a second so I'm not fighting with it. I know that the length is 2 bars, so I want to set 2 bars because what I want to do here, of course, is record my drum loop into my first pattern, and then we'll bring sample chops over. And again, bear in mind, I could have kept my drum sounds individual, played them in that way, and recorded them, but I wanted to resample and show you that, that workflow. So we want to bring our first loop in, which is our drum loop. We think it's 80 BPM. We're 2 bars, and then we have the option to quantize if we like. So I'm going to actually apply a little quantization here because I want it to snap right at the beginning of the pattern and make sure it plays the loop around without any human error. You can set your quantization by quarter notes, by 8 notes, 8ths and a third, which is like the triplet mode, I believe, and then you can do 16th notes. I'm going to leave it on 16. We need the little bit of the metronome volume because when you hit record for your pattern, it gives you a countdown of, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it begins to record. So I need to be able to hear that so I know when to press the pad. So let's make it relatively low. But we are now good to record our first pattern. So I can choose record here. As soon as I press record, that countdown is going to begin. And I generally try and time this so it's going with the current metronome so that it doesn't get confusing because it literally starts as soon as you press this. So if you're midway between the counts, it can be a bit confusing. And then we can hit stop here or hit the record button to stop our pattern recording. Now, you'll already hear there's a little bit of a BPM timing issue. So we've set our pattern to 80 BPM. We know that the loop is approximately 80 BPM. And if we play the pattern just on its own now without the metronome playing, we get this little double up timing as it comes around. You can hear the kick drum kind of doubling over. Whenever I hear that, and I can press cancel here if I want to stop my pattern from playing. Whenever I hear that coming around like that and I hear that double little kick, it usually means I need to speed up my pattern timing or the BPM. So we can do that. We can go to pattern select. We can go back to the pattern itself. We can do record. And of course, whenever you've set up a pattern of some kind, I can always re-record back into that pattern and we'll demonstrate that later. But I'm going to select the same one again. Hit record here. It's going to count down and the pattern's going to begin. Now I can go back to timing and BPM, and was it Control 2? I can set this at 81 BPM and see if it fixes that issue. And that sounds pretty good. So let's stop that. Let's stop the recording again. Just take a quick listen without the metronome in the way. Sounds good to me. We've eliminated that problem. So bear in mind, it thinks our BPM of our loop is 80 BPM, but our pattern BPM, we've actually set at 81 to make sure that that fits and it works. So again, just wanted to demonstrate a couple of little things with that there. So we've now created our first pattern. We can, of course, come in and create multiple patterns with different, timings, different elements, whatever it is that you want to do. Nice and simple stuff. So in order to do that, we're going to need a couple more things. And I'm not going to make this into any massive long track or anything. I just wanted you to see the options that you have. In terms of creating the patterns and the sort of sequences, if you like, we have the option, of course, to change the length and everything else. And if we go to length here, I don't know whether it will show me that unless I'm in pattern select mode. I might even have to select a new pattern. Let's say we were going to record a new one here. Let's turn the metronome off for a second. When we set the length of this, you can set all the way up to 99 bars, essentially. So if you want to make one really long pattern, you have the option to do that. I just wanted to show you that there can be as small as 1 bar, and you can go up to 99. In terms of the BPM ranges, I believe your BPM range on this device is from 40 to 200, I think. I'd have to double check that in the manual, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. We're just going to cancel that. We don't want to create a new pattern just yet. The next thing we're going to dive into here, where it gets a little bit more complicated, is the ability to record samples and sample chops is kind of more what I'm talking about, really. So we have a start and end point marker. Let's discuss that first and show you how that works. So keeping the same drum loop that we were just messing about with before, it's going to be nice and simple before we dive into anything else. I can choose to make a new recording, of course. I'm not going to worry about trying to record to an internal BPM because we're not trying to get this to sync. I want to set my start and end points manually here and show you how that works. So I'm just going to choose a pad to put this for now. We'll do record. Still our threshold is set, so it's still waiting for us, so that's nice. And because we've got 4 bars here, I'm going to let the whole 4 bars play, no stereo or anything. And then I'm going to come in and punch in some marker points and show you how that works. So let's just play this. That is 4 bars worth of audio. Take a second, it's recorded that. So we have 4 bars worth of audio. We know we don't need to worry about the starting point if, that's what we were just chopping up a little bit of. Because we had threshold enabled, we've got no dead space. However, let's say what I want is somewhere through this waveform and I only want a piece of this to loop up. Maybe I don't want the first bar and I want to start somewhere at like the second bar and maybe loop to the third. I can do that by creating my own start points and end points as well. And it's as simple as doing that. We will play the sample through. So we have our sample here. And whenever I get to the point where I want to mark in the start and the end, I can do that. First thing, I'm going to set that to loop mode. If you have the loop mode enabled before you punch your marker, your start and end marker in, you can hear the loop instantly. It will just jump to those points and start looping around and give you a good feel of how accurate that is. So let's do that. Let's play it. And you'll notice I'm going to leave a bar probably, punch in, and we'll create a loop here. Nice and simple. You can hear that looping around and our mark point has been set. So just like we did before when we had the device kind of do that automatically for us and create an endpoint that we then truncated down, we could do the same here. If that's all we wanted and we just wanted that loop, I could truncate that and just have it chop off any of the excess audio that we don't need. And I've got a loop there. And of course, with these mark points, I can make them as tight as I want. And if you want to delete them, you just press the sample and press the mark button while that sample's playing. It will clear those out of the way and you can start again. And of course, you can be as quick as you want and create very small little loops. So you can see how that could be useful for certain things. So we create a start and end point marker. That is our basic function for obviously creating start and end points. Those start and end points can be adjusted left and right, and we'll go through that in a second. So when it comes to sample chopping, bringing a sample in and wanting to, obviously do what we would do on Koala or the MPC, we're going to have to use those in a slightly different way because we don't have any middle markers. With Koala, the MPC, the SP-304 Mark II, you can create all these middle slice points throughout your waveform assign those to pads, and then you can play through those individually. Doesn't work like that on this device. It's limited, so we need to work around that limitation. What I'm going to do, we're going to delete this drum loop because we don't need it. And we are going to find a sample on here, some sort of melodic sample, maybe a Beat Butcher thing or something that we can mess about with. Where have we got Beat Butcher stuff? Let's find a music chop or any kind of chop. It doesn't really matter, just something we can slice up. It's not going to be a crazy complicated beat. But we need to think now a couple of things before we load this sample in and work out how we're going to work around creating chops and being able to do what we do on other samplers. So let's find a sample. We'll need an external source turned on. What else have we got here? It's an effect. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty gritty. It's pretty grimy. I like that. I'm going to load that up as my sample. So for you, of course, you might not have an iPad. Maybe you're working from a turntable. Spotify on your phone. You've got an audio source of some kind that you want to bring in so you can chop up your slices. Couple of basic ways that you could do that. Of course, there's plenty of other things that you can, use your imagination, but a couple of basic ways that I could see that you would do that. We have no copy button as discussed, so you have to resample in order to create a copy of something. I could record this entire sample here onto one pad, and then I could just resample that again from there and do it that way. If we have a device, any kind of device that has a stop and a play button, so if it was Spotify on your phone, I'd be tempted to kind of do it this way. This is the way I would work a lot, is that I can just play the sample up to the piece that I want and record that individual piece, then record the next piece and just record the slices that I want throughout that loop. That's generally what I would do with it. If we take a look at this sample, what I'm going to quickly do here is just normalize the volume of that so it's a little bit louder. There's a few things I want to discuss as we go through this. The next thing with this device is that we are limited in terms of pitching. So a big thing for a sample head like me is to take a sample, I want to chop it up, but a lot of the time I want to pitch it as well. Now, if you have a DJ turntable as your input source, you'll have a pitch slider so you can pitch it up and down a little bit. My DJ turntable's got pitch of plus and minus 50, so it's really good. You can really slow things down and speed them up. If you've got Koala Sampler, you're doing it this way. I can pitch it that way, and I can record it in before we do it. We could use YouTube and use very crude, but I'm sure you could change the speed of the playback of a video and use it that way. Very crude way of doing it, but that would be a bit of a workaround. And unfortunately, even though this device was released after the SP-302, which has a very nice pitch function, the pitch function on this is kind of useless. And I want to show you it because it's just, it's not very good at all. So let's just use our drums here. Got our drum loop playing. You will notice we have a pitch option here as an effect. Now you can hear a bunch of kind of mess there at the moment. That's because it's got a few other options. There's a feedback option. We want that off because we don't want any feedback. It kind of acts like a bit of a delay. And in terms of the balance, again, it's kind of like mixing the signals. We just want only the pitch signal. And you can hear that there. With Control 1, we can adjust the pitch there. And what you will notice is this is a time stretch. So as I play with the loop speed isn't going to change, but the pitch will. And it does it in a very old school kind of fashion. You'll hear it. It's got a very distinctive sound, which creatively for something like drum and bass might be really cool. But when you just want a simple pitch up and down to pitch your sample, you'll see why this isn't particularly very useful. There we are into typical drum and bass pitching for that old school jungle vibe. So we'll turn that off. So you can't do it that way, not to get a smooth, very non-time stretch pitch. As I said, you make jungle music and you want to slice up some breaks and do something fun. It's a good creative effect, but it's not what we're looking for here. I can use BPM for the sample itself, so you can edit the BPM of the sample. I think that is with Control 1 in this case. And as I play the sample now, Now, at a pinch, with something like drums where there isn't a lot of information, you might get away with that 1 or 2 semitones either way, because of course I can pitch it up, but that's not too bad. Even there's not, it's not horrible. But what you will find when you use something more melodic and you bring in a sample with a vocal or something like that, and you could hear it a little bit with the drums when I pitch it right down, it begins to distort and you get this almost like tremolo effect, and it's particularly noticeable on something more melodic. Again, if it's just a one shot, a bass sound, and you only pitch it a little bit here and there, there's some flexibility, but it's just not the best pitching device that's on this, unfortunately, and I wanted to cover that just in case you were thinking about it and what you can and can't do. So my advice would be, whatever your sound source is, if you have a way of pitching it before bringing the sample in, that's just going to be a much nicer way of doing it. As I said, you want to get crazy with the time stretch and get that old school jungle vibe. That's pretty cool, but I don't particularly want that in this case. I'm also going to turn that off, so when we go back, our sample plays as normal. So we want to bring sample in. Like I discussed, I would probably bring this in sections, and then I would tweak my start and end points if I need to. Now again, if we use the threshold and we're smart about how quickly we press record, we can limit the amount of, start and end point faffing around that we need to do. So let's say this is what we want to do. We got this sample. And one other thing, just while it's on my mind, you can actually be resampling from both your line in and the microphone input at the same time. Just thought I'd throw that out there. That is pretty clever that you can do that. Whilst, something else is playing, you can be resampling everything together. Of course, we're just using one input source here. But we're going to use this sample. I'm going to pitch it down by, I don't know, 2 semitones. I've made my pitch choice here. And I'm just looking at generally where the transients are, because if we did this automatically with Koala or something, it's going to look for the peaks of the transients, and I sometimes like just having those random chops, and somehow or other I'll make that fit to the beat. So what I can say here is, let's start recording this in. Now again, we have to touch quickly upon the limitations of the device in terms of what I mentioned earlier, the polyphony of the pads. If I want to do this to a pattern, and I want to be able to play, sort of more than 4 stereo sample chops and record those into my pattern, then I would want to have to, I would want to record all of these chops in mono so that I can have, 7 or 8 or whatever it is I want to load them onto the other banks. But if I do more than 4 stereo chops and I try to record those into the pattern, you're going to have problems. And again, it halves with resampling. You'll end up with only 2 stereo, samples that you can play with. So again, for the sake of this, I'm going to keep just recording in mono. Bear in mind here that the stereo button works with the external source on, so when I'm playing this, we're currently listening in mono. If I press this, might have to press this off and on. Sometimes it requires that. Oh, it's opened right up, and we suddenly have a stereo sample there. Stereo is, of course, nicer, and you can get away with it. But for the sake of this demonstration, I'm just going to keep everything in mono so that we can use as many pads as we need. So we've now got our drums here. We're going to start recording this in chunks. We'll do record, we'll choose a pad, choose record again. It's waiting for us. I'm just going to play up to this first transient, and I'm going to deliberately leave these probably a little bit sloppy because I need to, of course, demonstrate the start and end point functions here for you so that you can understand that. So let's do this. Just as it went into the next transient, I'm going to do that. As I said, if you've got a device like Spotify, you could just hit the pause button here, and then you can record in the next piece. And I'm just going to record probably 3 basic chops. We'll do record, start again. Went a little bit over on that one, but that's fine. In fact, actually, let's do that. Let's delete. I'm going to take both of those notes. I think that might be quite good. We'll delete that one very quickly. We'll do that one again. We'll do record, choose the pad, choose this here. And I'm actually going to leave it up to the next transient there, I think, or the main peak. So yeah, let's now record this one. Yeah, up to there. And then I will take probably from this kind of high note, and we'll just have to work with that in whatever way we can for today. I obviously don't have the time to jig it too much. So let's record, do pad 4, record, and play that up again. So probably just a big transient there. Yeah, that will do us. So that's the way that we record our individual chops in. And as I said, that could be stopping your turntable and doing it, tape player, iPad, Spotify, whatever. Something that you can at least just stop and play the playback here. We now have those loaded in. Now we run into the next limitation and problem of the device. You will hear as I press those pads there, ideally we want to put them into a choke group or a mute group so that we can just, play them and they turn each other off. That is not possible on this device. The workaround is to press pad and set them all to gate mode. And then you have to be reliant upon your finger playing skills. So let's say we got the beat here and I want to play those. I'm just going to play, but I'm only going to play one pad at a time. You get the idea. If I overlap them, they will play at the same time and you'll get a bit of a mess. But you can get away with it. That's enough to get away with that when you're recording something into your pattern. And we'll do that in a second. But let's talk about start and end points because that's obviously a basic editing function here. Now, because we're using threshold again, most of my start points are going to be correct. And when I'm making sample chops like that, if I'm not intending to play the full file through, then the endpoint's not really that much of a problem. So again, the workflow could be quite quick because I could have my beat and I could do all of that. I'm not reaching the end where I've got a couple of problems. But let's say you need to adjust your start and end points. I want to show you, of course, how you can do that. So we've got our sample here. Let's put it into loop mode so that I can hear what happens when it gets to the end. I don't want that little noise at the end. A really simple way is to use the start and end point markers, and you need to set these anyway because what you're going to do is introduce your start and end points, of course, as marks, and then you use your start and end parameters here, your functions on these rotary dials, to shift those marking points. So you need to set a start and end in order to move it. Now, what I'm going to do here, I'm not sure if this will work. Hopefully there's enough of Koala on screen if I open up Auto Chop, because I want to give you a visual representation of this. Now, it may seem like I'm making start and end points here and just tweaking those seem overly complicated, but actually this device works in a pretty interesting way, and I want to show you that. So let's say we've made a start and end point. So we're just going to grab these two markers so we can do a little bit of a visual demonstration there, what you can see on the screen. Let's take a listen to this sample. So I don't want that little end point in there. The easiest way and the quickest way generally is to mark it. So what I'll do, if the start point is good, I'm going to hit the mark and the pad at exactly the same time. And then I'm just going to try and get my endpoint in where I want to cut off the end of that sample and just make the piece that I want. That's the simplest way of doing that. Now, the problem is with a sample like that, I wasn't quite sure where that little end note was, but we've made some marks now. So we've essentially done this. We've put two marking points in on our sample. It doesn't coincide exactly with the waveform here, so don't worry about that. But you can see we've got two start and, a start point and an end point. And we can see that because we've highlighted it. And when we play back the sample in loop form, it's going to play what we've marked. So we've still got a little bit of that unwanted third noise there at the end, or the little tail end of that. So this is where start and end comes into play. And in its most simple format, it does exactly that. We choose start and end. And if we take a look at these dials here, when they're set in the middle to 0, our start and end points are marked. This control 1 is the start point and control 2 is the end point. So that is them set at 0. When I move the value to the left of, say, something like my start marker here, you'll notice nothing is happening currently, and that is because our start marker is at exactly the beginning of this sample. So really, if we were looking at a waveform, it's going to look a little bit more kind of like that. We're right at the beginning of the waveform. There's nowhere to go left here because we've marked it right at the beginning. If there was some audio before, and we marked it, we would be able to move back a little bit this way. When I move it the other way, of course, we're starting to move this marker by a value, and we can move that up to, I think it's 130 milliseconds is what it works out in the manual. It has a value of 30 on the device. So as I'm doing this, hard to do at the same time, but you'll see I'm shifting my point over by 30. All very basic stuff, and again, you might wonder why I'm explaining so much of this if you're familiar with sampling, but let me explain a little bit further. So our start point is fine. We don't need to worry about that. We've set that at 0. Very simple to adjust the end point, because of course, when we move our end point here, we're doing exactly the same thing. We're either moving it this way or we're moving it that way. That is, of course, dependent on whether you've left an extra tail both sides. And of course, this is an end marker, so we have audio here, and we have audio at the other side that we want rid of. So 0 is where it is placed. I'm going to move this left, inwards, an amount to try and get rid of the piece that we don't want. Very simple, self-explanatory stuff. So let's just listen to that. See if we can move that along a bit more. And you can hear we are shifting that point along. So yeah, very easy to understand, very basic. The one thing that's in the manual that I think is overlooked a little bit is that what seems like a limitation here, because we have this value, I can go whatever that 30 equates to. I'm not sure what the 130 milliseconds is, if that's, from one end of it to the other, because of course we can go both ways. But whatever this 30 value equates to, let's say it was 30 milliseconds, that is the limitation of how far we can move. Now, that is generally fine in most cases, because ideally you want to be good with your initial start and end marking point to get it, as close to the transient as you want, so that whenever you need to do your moving, you're only moving a little amount to get it where you go. And this 30 value is usually enough. However, what this does, which is quite interesting, is let's say we've set our endpoint and it is here, and that represents as 0, of course, on our dial. I move it along by 30. So whatever that equates to, 30 milliseconds, we've shifted it by its maximum amount. We are now stuck at that point. When I do the start and end button again, what it does is it resets that point back now to 0. So if we did that operation again, we went back into start and end. When I shift that now and I shift it another 30, I'm moving it from this point. And of course, I can go back the way. So I can move in increments of 30 each time, and it moves along. I just want you to be aware of that, because there has been the odd occasion I've marked it, I've got it close, I've moved my 30 milliseconds, if that's what we're talking about here, over, but it's just not quite enough. And you think, oh, I'm kind of stuck now. Do I have to go back and redo my start and end point? No, you can just repeat the operation, because it sets this back to 0 wherever you've left it after the first 30. And then I can move in 30. So hopefully that makes sense. I could just move throughout this entire sample. It's sort of 30 milliseconds, if that's what it is, segments all the way through to get where I want to go. Now, that would be incredibly tedious. You want to make sure your start and end points are close. But if you're struggling and you've got a marker that you've moved 30 milliseconds and you're almost at the transient, it's not quite there, just reset that with the button, turn it off, and redo the procedure. It's going to allow you to move another 30 seconds from that point, or 30 milliseconds. Just wanted to explain that because it is important. So let's come out of that. We now have our sample chops. Let's put that one, make sure that one is back in gated mode. And this one, and this one. You can see what we're doing. I'm going to pretend we've done all our start and end point editing, because I think we've spoke about that enough. There's no need for me to dive any further into that. You hopefully have a good understanding of how that works. And as I said, as long as my starting points are usually pretty good and I've got a long enough bit of a clip of a sample, I generally don't even need to do too much endpoint trimming anyway. So now we have some chops. We just want to finish off this, this episode by adding some more, elements to our loop here, just so that we can do that. So we're going to go back to pattern select. We're going to choose our pattern. So we're going to do record. We're going to choose the one we want to record to. And hopefully we should be able to just, continue adding to our pattern here. Let me just do cancel for a second. Just wanted to make sure my drums were still there. Had a feeling that I'd lost them for a second. Let's press stop on there. So yes, pattern select. We're recording. We're going to go back into pattern 1. And when we hit record, it's going to count down. Now, this time, I think I'm going to turn the quantization off if we have any applied, because I want to do these chops, and I just want to see if I can get a rough 2-bar loop going here. So we hit record, it's going to count us down, and we'll be able to begin. Now, you'll see instantly what my mistake was there, and that was that, of course, I didn't apply the metronome, so I couldn't hear when to start that off. So when we listen to our pad here, now it was a mistake, but actually it demonstrates another good point, and that is that you can erase notes out of your pattern. So this is our pattern here, or if we stop that, sorry, when we go to patterns here, this is our pattern. We are going to record, we're going to go back into the pattern, we're going to let that play. And you can hear we have this odd note because it's not supposed to be there. If I press delete, it then goes into erase mode, and I can erase any of the pads that I've put in here. So I can select number 2 here because I know that was the one that I had. Just make sure it comes all the way around. Come out of that. And we're back to our plain loop. So that will now allow me to go back to start and level. And I can add my metronome back in, and I can begin, to record. That, of course, if we stop recording there, that is, of course, useful if I want to start from the beginning and I want my countdown. Of course, I can just keep recording into that pattern with it playing around. So really there, I could have just started playing my chops again, because I can see the pattern, I can see where I'm up to, whether I'm at the beginning of the first bar, and I could have gone for it that way. But I just wanted to touch on those points again and show you that we can set the metronome up and do it again. So we're going to do record, we're going to choose the first pattern again, and we're going to do record, it's going to count down. Now, my timing there, I kind of jumped off the pad a little bit quickly. So we've got a couple of little gaps there in the timing. There isn't too much way of shifting things around on this device, but I want to talk about the fact that we still have, access to our effects here and how that works with, pattern mode. So it works exactly the same as applying effects when we were in recording mode. Unfortunately, there is no resampling from the pattern mode, which would be really nice. It'd be great to be able to make a pattern and then resample that out, because of course we could just use a loop and turn off the drums. But again, if you use an external metronome, there are a couple of workarounds for that, like I was talking about before. If you want to just have your chops, you could record those chops and resample them to a metronome and then fit them back with the beat. It's, faffy, but it's possible. But let's say on the chops here, we wanted to add a little bit of delay or something like that to just fill in those gaps. If we take a quick listen as it's coming around again. Now, of course, I could go back and just do a better job of playing those, but if I just wanted to fill in the gaps, let's say I wanted to add a little delay, I can add that now to these pads. So I could say here, let's turn it off for a second, choose the right pad. I'm going to add it to 2, and I'm going to hit remain like we did before. And I'm going to add it to 4 as well. And now when we play back our pattern, we'll get a little bit of delay in between there, which will probably just fill in those little gaps that we had. Not the best there, and I would probably just level play with the timing of the delay effect. But keep in mind that once you've built your pattern, if you do some resampling beforehand, you resample in your reverb, you resample your drums and get any effects that you want in beforehand, you then have the option as your patterns are playing to use these other effects as well. And you can send those to, certain pads. Still limited to only one effect per pad, so keep that in mind. But that is what resampling is for. Get all your grit for your drums applied when you're, in the earlier stages. Means that essentially you could keep all of these for like performance effects, so I could use the slicer or mess around and do that kind of stuff. I think we are kind of drawing to the end of this tutorial as a sort of sample heads guide to it. I hope it's been clear, and I've explained everything pretty well as we've gone along. I will put some time codes in because I understand this has been a long video. We're over an hour here. But I really wanted to dive into what this device was capable of and not capable of. To sort of end here, I just want to talk about the pattern modes. So let's say you create multiple patterns. Unfortunately, there is no pattern copy. So we can, it's the same as when you have a sample. We can't just copy one, and we have no option to resample there. There is a couple of workarounds, but I'm not going to dive into those just now because this is just for basic stuff here. But essentially, that's what you kind of have to work with. So if it were me and I was building stuff up, I would probably just do, a very similar thing here. On one pad, let's say this is going to be my intro. Maybe I just have the samples playing like the chops. Then on the next pad, I program in some drums, and then I add those sample chops on top. The next one, I could add a few more effects or do something else like that. That would be a very simple way to just build a very, an intro, some chorus, some verses. And of course, you can add as many samples and layers onto that as you want, which would fill out the beat and make it sound good. I was going to dive in and add a couple of vocals and some effect stuff, but it's already been an hour, so I think we'll put this one to rest. In terms of your patterns when playing, let's take a look at that. So we have some basic functions for the patterns. When we're in pattern select, obviously we can play the pattern that we've recorded and it's going to light up wherever there is an available pattern. I can, of course, record a new pattern and make something new here. If you want to delete a pattern, it's exactly the same as deleting a sample from a pad. We do delete, we choose, then we press delete again, or we can cancel out of that. And again, you can do the cancel and delete, and I can delete all patterns. And I can delete all the patterns, but not delete the samples because that is independent. So keep that in mind. But we have those options there. In terms of changing, I'm trying to work, I can't remember if change does work here. If we do delete and record. Yeah, so I can still change the order of a pattern if I like. I can shift the pattern over here and I can do that kind of stuff. We have all of the same basic functions. In terms of when patterns are playing, there is no kind of lock-in to the sequence. And if let's just very, very quickly make something else on another pattern here so that I can demonstrate that. Let's record to a new pattern. Of course, we've got our timer kicking over there. One thing also to bear in mind, your value here, your BPM, is global for the device. So every pattern you make is going to be set at whatever that is. So if I change the BPM on this particular pattern, which you can still change your BPMs as we saw earlier, it will change the BPM for this pattern and all of the others as well. It's not independent like on the newer devices. But if we just record something very basic in here, just needs something to play along to. Let's put quantize on the length of 2. Where are we? Let's do 2 like that. Quantize to 16 and record. And because we set our BPM earlier, we knew that was going to be right as that drum loop was playing around, as long as it was quantized right and it snapped to the grid. So I now have a pattern of drums. And you will hear it's still using those, effects that we set up and everything else. So that's nice and handy. The one last thing there that I'm trying to demonstrate is that when you switch between your patterns and you're, chaining together what could be a track, so you've got one's an intro and everything else, it has no kind of locking mechanism to make sure that you can't really mess that up. So it is dependent on your timing. And what you'll notice is that when we press pattern select and we have a pattern playing, it switches back to the sample mode so that you can still, trigger other samples if I wanted. I could. I can still trigger samples over the top of that. So you're doing more of a live performance, you want to just trigger the odd vocal. You can still do that because it automatically switches back. So when you want to switch between your patterns, you need to always hit pattern select beforehand. So I'll play the first pattern. It's gone back into sample mode. I want to start playing this next pattern. You can see I can do that there. But just watch as I do that sloppily. There's nothing locking that. It's reliant upon your timing there. So you have to be pretty good, making sure your timing as your loops come around are pretty decent there, because it is instantaneous. It will automatically jump to the next one. And as far as I'm aware, there is nothing to lock that in or to, quantize those sequences being played. So yeah, you can kind of lock it into your groove. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. At some point, I might dive in and do a video on all the individual effects and just do a couple of just general beat making videos like I do with Koala, where I don't talk through the whole process. I just wanted you to know what this device was all about, what it's capable of. I think it's actually really fun. Despite its limitations, there are workarounds, as you've seen, and you can still do some really good stuff with this. I mean, Madlib did some great stuff with it. So I'll leave you with that thought, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Take care.